This is, philosophically, the whitening stage is to purify, to clean away the layers, the conditioning, the habits, the mechanicity, the self-centeredness, these layers of our personality that we've accumulated over years, which we often don't question, which we often identify with. We even think we are the layers, but it's just accumulation. And if we scrub that away slowly, we start to discover the depth of the potential inside us. Which then brings us to the third stage, rubedo, or redness. The reddening, this is when mercury is added to the white stone, which goes green and then red. And this process represents the union of opposites, and the result is referred to as the elixir vitae, the elixir of life, which supposedly gives immortality to the subject. Again, if we understand this symbolically, they're talking about the immortality of the inner being who has transformed themselves. And for me, the expression of this in life, in daily life, is enthusiasm. Because a lot of ancient traditions are misunderstood in their apparent obsession with immortality, that they physically, literally wanted to live forever. What they're talking about is awakening the enthusiasm of the inner being that gives us the motivation to persevere in life no matter what. With joy, with openness, with generosity. That's immortality because it is the idea of eternal youth. To remain young inside our whole lives. For Jung, this stage represents the final stage of analysis. It's the resolution of conflicts in the psyche, and it's the balancing of opposites. And Jung felt that this was most of his work every day with his clients, was trying to bring about this balance in the psyche. So it's through his study in alchemy, as I mentioned earlier, that he determined that the unconscious and consciousness, these are not destinations, these are processes which we can understand. And through a practical methodology we can experience, not just abstractly, but in our everyday behavior, in our work to become more whole, more complete. And this became one of the large bases of his theory of analytical psychology and individuation. I was asked another question just at the break there, which I think is kind of useful to explain some things as well from an ethical or a moral point of view. The question was in relation to what we were talking about just before the break, about this idea of progression and you know, what are examples of that? How do you measure this idea of reaching a certain level of consciousness which then becomes permanent or irreversible? And the example I often use is, you know, what they talk about in antiquity in terms of the moral practice of ethics is to develop latent potential. Very similar idea in terms of transformation, transmutation. And for us as individuals, if we're developing certain qualities, usually timeless in nature, but obviously subjective in our experience, it's a question of how we develop that, transform that, integrate that into our everyday lives until it becomes a part of who we are. And the simple example is if you want to develop courage, let's say that's something that you want to develop. Random example. Let's say you're shy. And you want to develop courage, you have to practice it. You have to exercise your courage. And that's a transformation because you're changing the form, you're changing the behavior of what you do. Let's say you're at something like this and you talk to people where you would be terrified otherwise. As an example, so you practice it somehow. And that practice requires an effort. So there's a conscious and continuous need to progress in that. But gradually you're transforming and you're changing the way that you're doing things, integrating that courage as something more active, more natural, until eventually the transmutation is when you see that the courage is there. It's not just that you have to act courageously, you now are courageous. It's more innate, it's more natural, you can call upon it at will when you need it. It requires less of an effort because it's now a stage of consciousness that you've integrated fully and you've achieved. These things don't always mean that you don't lose it or something can't come to challenge it. Sometimes the tests of life come to kind of verify, have you really developed courage? But ultimately, these are the stages that we can use to see in ourselves, am I progressing? Am I changing? But that requires a plan, a methodology of work that we can actually engage in the continuous and progressive development of those potentials. That is ethics, in summary. I'll talk a little bit about that at the end of the class, the presentation for anyone who's interested in learning more about our course, because ethics is one of the main areas. But I thought it was an interesting question and useful to kind of explain a little bit what we mean by this development and achieving of a new stage of consciousness. Because sometimes it seems too abstract, especially if we talk about something like nirvana, enlightenment, we're thinking about something just way beyond us. Okay, perhaps it is, but the progressive development of our potential is something that anyone is capable of. So I just wanted to share that before we continue. And then to conclude, I was going to talk about 3 elements, if you remember, and the third is synchronicity.